All right, so here in lesson 14, we're going to cover methods. In other programming languages, this is called functions, but the whole idea here is we're going to make a block of code that is going to do some work and then return an output or a value to us. And what I've done here is I've created a new Windows Forum application, and I want you to do the same thing. And you're going to have two labels here, metric and imperial, and then you'll have two text boxes. And you'll go ahead and make sure that you change the names here to text_metric and then text_imperial. And then we'll have a convert to metric button, and then we'll have a convert to imperial button. So the whole idea here is we're going to make a couple of methods that convert one input value to another value. So from metric to imperial and imperial to metric. And we're going to make some methods that basically do that work for us and then return the resultant value. Okay, to get started, we're going to go to the upper right-hand corner here in the Solution Explorer. We're going to select on Lesson 14, which is the project inside of this solution. And we're going to right-click on that, and we're going to say Add, and we'll say New Item. So very similar to the classes training video before this. And we will then choose Class again, and we are going to change Class 1 to Conversion Tools. So conversiontools.cs. And again, the .cs stands for C#. Now, when we add that, it's going to open this up, and you'll see that conversiontools.cs file exists here now inside of the project. And we're going to go ahead and change this to public class, but we're also going to change this by adding public static class. So in the previous training examples where we were doing classes, we were making instance-based classes. So what that means is, like, for instance, with the cars, we were creating a class and a recipe for describing cars, but we were making multiple instances from that. So car 1, car 2, car 3, and car 4. In a static class or singleton, basically what we're doing is we're just saying that, hey, we're going to make a class that does not need to have multiple instances. It's just going to have some power tools or methods on it that's going to return some values for us that we just can continually call without having to make new instances of that. And I'll explain that here in a little bit. All right, so underneath that, we're going to make these conversion methods. Now, whenever you do any kind of functions or methods, essentially everything needs to live on a class of some sort. And so that's why we had to create this conversion tools class. I could have actually come directly into the code of the form, and I could have made these methods inside of this form class. So here's the form class code block here, and I could have made some methods inside of here. But just from a coding practice, I haven't really been kind of doing this in the training so far, but really you should separate any of your kind of business logic or any of your intelligence or logic in your code. You should really separate that from the user interface as much as possible, because you may switch to WPF at some point, and you don't really want to tangle your logic code that you do that returns information or does actual work. You don't really want to confuse and mingle that too much with your user interface code. So it's just a good standard practice to start creating separate classes to manage doing the actual work and logic, and then just kind of interacting and sending that data back up to the form or to your user interface. Again, that's a little bit more of an intermediate and kind of advanced kind of step. I've been trying to keep things as simple as possible, so I've been just writing code directly in the user interface, event handlers and code blocks. But here, this is just kind of a step towards that direction of, showing you how to create separate C# files, separate classes, do the work, and then return the values in the data. All right, so inside of this static class, what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of methods. So to do this, we'll just say public, and then I'm going to say that I want this method to return a double value. And then I'm just going to go ahead and say, basically, the name of this class is MET for metric. And I'm just going to go ahead and then put some parentheses. And what I'm doing with a method here is that I'm giving the method a name. And then I have these parentheses here because I may want to pass parameters into this function or into this method that's going to help it do some calculations. So I'm going to go ahead and type in imperial value. And then whenever you do a method, you need an open and closed curly brackets to define the code block for what this method is going to do. Now, what I've done here is I've got this double keyword, which is basically saying that this function or this method, when it does its work here inside the code block, it's going to return a double value as the result of this function or of this method. Then the only reason why we have the public in here is because we want to make sure that this method is publicly exposed and somebody can use this whenever they call the conversion tools class. And we also need to have static in here. Since the class itself is static, all the methods inside of that class also need to be static as well. All right, so let's go ahead and say double, and I'm going to call this metric value. And again, now you're seeing me kind of differentiate the naming convention. Here I did like a capital at the beginning of this word and then a lowercase at the beginning of this word. So again, you can read online, there's a variety of different styles and coding kind of standards for naming conventions on variables and objects. Some people will actually name internal fields and things that are just inside of methods and not publicly exposed. They'll name them with a lowercase to help differentiate and showcase that versus publicly exposed fields and properties and things like that, or class names, and they'll put a capital in the name. So again, you can study online what is the best fit for you, but I'm just showing you an example here of how you can kind of differentiate those. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the imperial value and I'm going to multiply that by 25.4. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and say return. So this is the key word here inside of a method or a function, that I'm going to do this work here, and then I'm just going to return the resultant value, which is this double value here. So I'm going to return metric value. Now I could have also written this here where I don't really need to declare this metric value. I just wanted you to see that from a thought process point of view, that I'm taking the imperial value that was an input, multiplying it, and getting a resultant number. I could have also just come in here and just said return, and then we don't really need this extra statement. So in fact, we don't need this either. We can just return the direct multiplication result of imperial value times 25.4, because multiplying these two double numbers is going to return a double, and so there we go. Now let's go ahead and just copy this code here, and then we will paste this, and we're just going to change the next one to imp, and we will change this to metric value. And what you can do is you can refactor this. We actually did this in the previous video where we renamed something. So I can take imperial value, right click, and then say rename, and you'll see that it highlights both of them, and it's going to allow me to change basically this input name, and then it will chase that through on all of the code inside of this code block or this method. So then we'll say apply, and instead of multiply, we're going to divide. Now you might look at this and go, wow, this is a lot of, this seems like a lot of extra work. I could have just written times 25.4 throughout my code everywhere, wherever I needed to do conversions. Well, this is actually a little bit cleaner. So if you think about this, this is whenever you decide to make a method or a function here, really what it is you're thinking, oh, I'm having to do this operation over and over again, multiple times. And so rather than writing out the full code multiple times in your main code, you basically have a function or a method do that work for you, and then you just get the result of that. And you may have different inputs here. So I may have 35.5 millimeters that are being passed in here, 55 millimeters, 130 millimeters. And then it's always just going to do this consistent work rather than you having to code the multiplication in your main code over and over again, which is a little bit trashy and harder to maintain. So again, that's the real value of functions, is it helps sort of take repetitive tasks and it blocks it together into one single function here or method that does that work and returns a value. Now, one other coding practice is that don't make methods too complicated. I mean, sometimes in my code, I'm making stuff and I make a method way too complicated. I have too much stuff going on and then it's hard for another programmer to follow. Really, methods should be basically doing some work and typically just returning a very simple answer, right? So you have some inputs and you have it do some work and give you one answer, and it's the method is focused on doing one specific thing. If you put too much information in one method itself, again, it just becomes a little bit more complicated to try to follow your code and then debug and kind of restructure or refactor and fix things later if you need to enhance or change it. So just try to keep your code a little bit clean, especially with methods and functions. Now we have everything. Let's just go ahead and see if this builds. So let's say build solution, and it looks like everything builds. Now I'm going to show you one other way of doing methods. So there is also a public and then void. So in this case, we need the static, but we can also say void, and we can just say example method and not pass any parameters to it. And maybe this, basically this method would actually do some work, but it doesn't need to return a data value. Now, honestly, static, like in a static class like this kind of doesn't really make sense. I don't know why I would ever do this. Usually when you have these void methods like this that are doing some work, they're really used more on instance-based classes where you're actually doing some internal kind of code and some work, and it might set some internal properties and fields. So I'm going to show just one example of that again at the end of this video, so you can kind of see that in its use case. But this is also another form of method where basically you're not returning any value here. You're just doing some work. So I might say something like double, and we'll just say added value and equals 3 plus 6, right? And notice in here that there is no return statement because I am not returning any value because I set void here. So again, this is another example of using a method. Now we're going to just go ahead and delete that out because we don't really need that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to my form code here. So I'll go back to the form designer, and there's this convert to metric and convert to imperial button. I'll just double click on each of those buttons. So that way it creates event handler blocks of code for me. And then we're going to call our conversion tools class. Now the first thing I'm going to need to do is if I'm converting something to metric, then I need to go get the imperial input value. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say try. So we're going to do a try catch because we're going to have to parse the string from the text box into a double value. So I'm going to say try, and then we'll have a catch. And really, we don't need to do anything there. So another way to do the catch statement, especially if you're not going to catch the exception or do anything there, is to just do basically like this here, the curly brackets up on the top line, which just saves a little bit of room. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say try, and I'm going to put double, and I'll just say basically imperial value equals double dot parse. And I'm going to get the imperial input value from the text box on the form UI. So text imperial.text property. And so if that doesn't work, like if we input a bad value there, then basically the exception handler is going to catch that and then just make sure it doesn't crash our application. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write conversion tools. And there it is. See the conversion tools class. And instead of making an instance with a new keyword like I did in the previous training, I'm just going to call these methods directly from the conversion tools class since it's a static class. So I'm going to just go ahead and say that I want to get the imperial value, get the metric value from this imperial number. So I'm going to pass the imperial value to that specific method, and then we'll get the result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then go ahead and set the result of that. So see how when I hover over here over the method name, it basically shows me that it returns a double type. So you can kind of see there in the IntelliSense that it returns a double type value. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say text underscore metric dot text equals the result of this function, and I'm going to put .toString because I need to convert that to a string to assign that back to the user interface and this text field on the text metric text box. Okay, so honestly, this is pretty much the code. Let's go ahead and we will copy and paste that, but we're just going to switch this from imperial value to metric value. So I'm just going to again refactor this by right-clicking and renaming this, and we'll just call this metric value. And we'll change this from text imperial to text metric. And we'll change this to basically, oh, nope, that already refactored and caught that. We'll just change this to text imperial. And so we're just switching this around. So let's go ahead and see if this actually works. So if we go to build solution, we'll see that our code had built successfully. We'll debug this. And let's just say that I start with 25.4. Let's say that we're going to convert to imperial. And oh, looks like I've got to go ahead and take a look at that. And we'll say convert to metric. And we see that the right fields are actually working, but we need to go ahead and take a look and see if I've done this incorrectly. Nope, didn't do it incorrectly. I just kind of flopped the numbers in my mind. So if I actually start with imperial of 1 inch and I say convert to metric, it gives me 25.4. So if I had 25.4 millimeters, so watch this, if I just get rid of this here and say convert to imperial, oh, no, something still seems strange there. So 25.4 millimeters needs to give me 1 inch in imperial. So I need to go ahead and check that and see what's wrong with my method. All right, so after quickly looking at this, it's not that I have my method necessarily wrong. I have the wrong method being called here, and this is one of those disadvantages of copying and pasting code. You forget to change certain things. So here, when I'm actually converting this metric value to imperial, I need to switch this to the imp method here that we created. And so now let's just go ahead and run that again, and let's see if this works. So we'll type in 1 for imperial, and I'll say convert to metric. So that works. And just to make sure that this is working correctly, I'm going to clear everything out. And let's just say 25.4, and we'll say convert to imperial. And there we go. Now we have 1 inch as the resultant value. So this is a great, very simple and easy to understand example of two things. One, we're showing you how to use static classes. So that way, we don't need to create an instance of this over and over. We just have a collection of power tools that we're going to be using. And essentially, we can add some static functions or methods inside of there that we're going to constantly call to just return different values to us. This is much cleaner and simpler for our code, especially for this repetitive task, than adding that multiplied by 25.4, dividing by 25.4 constantly throughout our code, especially if we're doing that on multiple items. This is a very common thing that happens, for instance, in the Tekla API, because in the Tekla API, everything underneath the hood is all in millimeters and metric, whereas commonly in the US, you may be working with the imperial environment, and so you may want to be doing conversions and things like that between the two units, and so little power methods like this are really handy. Now, one other small intermediate sort of documentation feature that is good for you, especially if you're making kind of some more professional code or you want to remember what your method does, is you can actually come in here and above the method itself, you can put 3 slashes, 3 forward slashes, and then what it's going to do is it's going to kind of create some documentation for you. And so this is where you can actually describe what this method does. And so you can write in converts the metric value to imperial, and then you can actually kind of just describe what it returns here and what this parameter is, and kind of what its description is. So you can say what is the imperial value. So this is the original imperial value, and so I'm just going to go ahead and save this. Now watch this. If I go back over to my form and I hover over like basically this method, see how it puts in the IntelliSense converts metric value to imperial. And it basically just gives me a description about like what these different fields and things are. So then if I, as I'm going through the code here and I'm putting things in, notice the documentation that I put on the imperial value input parameter, it actually describes that original imperial value. So this is a fantastic way to make your code or any kind of power tools and functions and methods that you make a little bit more usable, especially if other people are going to be using this library of tools and things that you make in your code.